When talking about women's sport, there are three types of people. The people who think that women shouldn't be playing sport and should be in the kitchen. The people who think women should play and progress but believe the standard is inferior so don't watch it. The people who love women's sport, see equal entertainment value and skill but believe in different categories for men and women. Now, society tells us that we should only be worried about category 1, the explicit sexists and misogynists. They are the morally bad, malicious monsters that we should cancel and educate, whereas the actions and beliefs of categories 2 and 3 people aren't misogynistic or sexist. They are morally good people for being pro-women in sport. But this is where I think we've made a serious mistake. Sexism, misogyny, patriarchy and oppression aren't just about one-off incidents of discrimination or the views of outright misogynists. Labelling category 3 as malicious, monstrous people directs our attention away from the wider issue, the insidious, subtle, collective acceptance and respect of male superiority, power and privilege. So as well as category 1, categories 2 and 3, the moderate liberals, are exactly the people we should be worried about. So my question to you is, are these views and the people who hold them really that different? Today we're going to talk about how organised sport perpetuates an ideology of male superiority and domination. Basically, in other words, sport promotes the idea that men are superior to women through ideas about differences between the sexes, which also legitimises men having power over women. All three categories of people rely on the idea that men and women are just biologically different. This is biological essentialism or gender essentialism. The idea that there are innate biological and psychological differences between men and women. Basically, that there are a set of properties that make a man and a set of properties that make a woman. The idea that women should be in the kitchen assumes that women have a biology that makes them natural caretakers. The idea that women's sport is inferior assumes that all women are slower, weaker, and less powerful than men. And the idea that men's and women's sport should be separate assumes that there are natural biological differences.
It's a completely different sport. The men are a lot faster, and they serve harder, they hit harder. It's just a different game. And
it is just common sense.
However, to call biological differences objective facts ignores how they've been constructed, changed, and reproduced throughout history. They aren't fixed differences. They have been reshaped and repackaged by people with power for over hundreds of years for political gain. The point was to literally subordinate women and to defend any inequalities between men and women in Western sports. Rewind back to the 1800s, sport was becoming more organised with the rules and regulations that we see today. But it was seen as the natural domain of men where they could attain Victorian ideals of masculinity, like aggression, competitiveness, gentlemanly conduct, and physical prowess. To be good at sport was to be a real man. On the other hand, femininity ideals said that women were inherently weak, frail, emotional, cooperative, and passive. They couldn't possibly take part in sport or exercise. Many people don't realise that sport could have actually shown that men and women were equal and that any sexual differences that did exist were actually very minimal. But this would threaten ideals of masculinity and femininity. So authority figures in medicine wanted to preserve the male domain and stop women getting involved. So what did they do? They deliberately constructed and exaggerated huge differences between the biological sexes.
Silly!
Authors across Europe and North America literally came up with scientific explanations for women's inferior nature. The most pervasive one was the conservation of female energy thesis. In 1873, Dr. Robert Barnes wrote, "The functions of ovulation, gestation, labour, lactation, the menopause, in turn all dominate over the entire organism of woman." In 1887, the chairman of the British Medical Association proposed that for the progressive movement of the human race, women should be denied education and other activities which would cause constitutional overstrain and an inability to produce healthy offspring. To stop women from joining sport and departing their roles as wives and mothers, they fabricated facts that they would literally overexert themselves and put their fertility at risk. And what were once just ideas took hold and became a material reality. Quote, "Middle-class women followed the dictates of fashion and wore restricting clothes, ate little and took no exercise, so that not surprisingly they would often faint, become ill and behave submissively, thus confirming the medical stereotype of the delicate female. Women were believing in their own inferiority, reinforcing the validity of science, and stopped participating in sport. It was just as the experts intended. Then, because large numbers of men and boys were seen to play sports and women were not, this confirmed the natural biological differences between them. So if you're wondering, did men claim that the traits required for sport, aggressiveness, competitiveness, and physical power, were innate to them, and then make it really difficult for women to join in, then claim that just proves sport is innate to men and meant for men only? Yes, you would be absolutely right. We are going round in circles. However, active feminist movements pushing for women's education challenged this, and schools and universities finally introduced physical education into lessons. So in reaction, medical opinion and people in power found ways to rework in the conservative ideas of ladylike behaviour. Instead of sport threatening female fertility, it could now actually provide the healthy preparation needed for childbearing and domestic roles. And now that sport was in the education system, medical opinion couldn't stop upper class women from exercising. But what they could do was control the amount and type of exercise that was allowed for women. Sports such as croquet and archery were acceptable because they required little physical exertion and were easy spaces to display femininity. Even in the early days of tennis, wealthy women would use their private courts to fulfill their objective of finding a husband, as they could show themselves off in an innocent and acceptable way. But controlling what types of sports women played led to feminine appropriate sports and masculine appropriate sports into the 20th century. Just what those with power and authority wanted. Sports appropriate for women were anti-competitive, and as Michael Messner argued, were, quote, responsible for continued survival of women's athletes, as women's sport was successfully marginalised and thus easily ghettoised and ignored. It also ensured that, for the time being, the image of the female athlete would not become a major threat to the hegemonic ideology of male athleticism, virility, strength, and power. A pattern becomes clearer as you navigate the 19th and 20th centuries. Quote, the survival of reactionary attitudes about the limitations of female biology continued to influence the type and extent of women's involvement. Women were making choices about sports, but within the structures of constraint. Women were constantly disrupting expectations of femininity, but not without resistance, which meant they had to compromise by accepting the innate differences between men and women to make such progress. You can play your sport, but don't forget, you are first and foremost a baby machine that serves your husband. Naturally then, in marginalised feminine appropriate sports, women had more freedom over their progress. But when they entered masculine appropriate sports like football, rugby, cricket and baseball, it all went to Men had a monopoly on all the resources and held controlling and decision-making positions, so they made the lives of women really difficult. Athletics required power, action, speed and strength, all the exact opposite traits of natural femininity. So when women took part, the fears of men and those in power became a reality. Women's bodies became masculinized. So of course, female athletes faced fierce opposition and accessing facilities was made almost impossible. For example, the Men's Amateur Athletic Association, responsible for organising competition, was set up in 1880. It took 40 years for the corresponding Women's Association to be set up in 1922. Even once the Women's Athletics Association was set up, its female administrators held the view that women were, quote, primarily designed as mothers and should therefore be aware of the long-term effects of over-vigorous exercise. It would be crazy if you heard someone say today that women should be in the kitchen or that women shouldn't be muscly. You'd never hear that today. Ever. I'm so glad that as a society we can finally say that we have moved on from that. It was the same story for women's football too. Dick Kerr's Ladies, formed in 1917 by women's munitions workers, played in huge crowds of 53,000 and raised £3,000 for local charities. However, the Football Association withdrew their support in 1921 and banned women from playing on any FA-affiliated pitches. The game of football is quite unsuitable for females and should not be encouraged, the FA said at the time. I have never heard anyone say that nowadays. Ever. It honestly would have saved everyone so much time if those in power had just been honest and said that they didn't want to lose their power and privilege.
Scared of what? Women? No, that's bonkers.
Now, disclaimer, I have just tried to summarise the entirety of women's sport in the West, which is definitely not best practice. But the point is that you often hear the narrative that the rise of women's sport has been a gradual, natural, progressive process. Now women can compete in the same sports. Yay! Equality! This is an oversimplistic narrative deliberately concealing the wider issue. The wider issue being that women have spent centuries defying standards of femininity in order to make progress, but not without constraints or resistance. At every step, compromises were made to make progress. Women have had to accept the ideas from those in power that they are naturally biologically and psychologically different from men, that they are weaker. So the notion that men and women are biologically different was never just a simple fact. These differences were deliberately constructed as natural and made a reality to serve the interests of those with control and decision-making power, which were to prove men's superiority over women in sport to then justify male control over all resources and wealth in sport. And this still happens to this day. We like to think that the women shouldn't play sport crowd are long forgotten distant cousins of those who are now pro-women in sport. But the reality is They are just different branches of the same tree, sharing the same roots of male superiority, privilege, and power. Next time you think or hear the argument that men and women are biologically different, remember when and who that came from, and ask yourself whose interest does that serve? The history books show that this belief has never been used to protect women. Please comment below your thoughts as you watch this video, as I'd love to hear from you.
I'm going to be very real here for a second. As you can probably tell, I've been crying a little bit. I always get these comments, but like recently it kind of ramped up. I get comments being called a man and being called masculine and asking if I'm on steroids. There will always be negative people out there, and they put women in a box, and they think of women should be fragile and petite and quiet and meek.
You don't look like a woman. You're too masculine. You're too muscly. I don't think muscle looks good on a woman. You're mannish. Are you a real woman? They were saying this back in the early 1900s. The belief in natural differences between men and women and expectations of femininity and masculinity are well and truly alive. Despite perceptions of gender equality in sport, the ideology of male superiority is consistently reworking itself into our lives, into our homes, schools, the media. So we're all on the same page, I'm going to lay out some ground rules. Gender and sex are two different things. Sex refers to the biological features of men and women, such as chromosomes, sex organs, hormones, and other physical features, whereas gender refers to social factors like behaviour, identity, appearance, character traits. Basically the non-biological stuff. Gender essentialism is when gender and sex are conflated. Your behaviour, your traits, your appearance is said to be determined by your biological makeup. The terms masculinity and femininity refer to the traditional traits and societal expectations that are assigned to and expressed by individuals depending on their gender and the cultural context. Boys will be boys is a common gender essentialist phrase that you often hear today, implying that boys cannot help but act in masculine ways, as if they were born aggressive and competitive, usually because of the testosterone they have. But we all know it's bullshit because there are men in our lives who aren't aggressive or competitive and they don't have a singular sporting bone in their body. And masculinity and femininity looks completely different in different cultures. Some cultures don't even have two genders. An anti-essentialist believes that when you are born, you aren't born with a feminine or masculine essence. Once we start growing up, we are told boys and girls do certain things, and eventually you pick it up and acquire a gender. For example, boys aren't born revving cars obnoxiously. That's definitely a learned behaviour. This is called socialisation, where infants internalise societal expectations to behave a certain way. This then shapes things like what hobbies they choose, what they wear, what haircut they get, how they act. Once you've been assigned a gender at birth, it determines your material reality at home. As Hargreaves explains, quote, "Girls tend to be handled more gently, boys are tossed around and wrestled more frequently and vigorously, girls are more closely supervised and allowed less physical freedom, boys are encouraged to be adventurous and to play vigorous out-of-door games, girls are given domestic toys, skipping ropes and Barbie dolls, boys are given fighting toys, footballs and action men, and as children quickly learn what it means to be a boy or a girl, they also start to feel pressure and anxiety around fulfilling those roles." Hargreaves points out that girls are often allowed to emulate boy behaviour like climbing trees, playing football or getting into scrapes, quote, "but only on the condition she grows out of it. Boys don't get such leeway. If they play girl games or act feminine, then they suffer great stigma full stop and are likely bullied for it. When it comes to sport then, huge numbers of boys are encouraged into highly competitive sports, with aggression, toughness and violence celebrated. The numbers are much lower for younger girls, and they are also more likely to join sports that are more aesthetic and expressive, such as dance, ballet, gymnastics and netball. So from when you're born, and whether you like it or not, you are shaped by these socially constructed differences, which are perceived as natural, and then they become a reality. What it means to be a woman or a man, a boy or a girl, in sport or out of sport, is heavily decided before you've even stepped out the door. At school, these divisions of acceptable behaviour for boys and girls are reinforced. We have single-gender schools, and in mixed schools there are separate toilets, changing rooms, cloakrooms. Children also segregate in playgrounds, friendship groups. A typical playtime often sees boys playing sports with girls watching on the side. Boys and girls are often separated in sports and are taught sports appropriate for their gender, or have the sport adapted for their gender. For example, girls will play tag rugby while the boys play rugby. However, do you ever see female-dominated sports becoming more popular among boys? Comment below if you've heard otherwise, but it's rare that you hear about boys being encouraged into sports like netball, gymnastics, dance or ballet. That said, UK physical education guidance states that the gender stereotypes that we know exist in sport and physical activity must be identified by all staff in schools and challenged appropriately. For some, they may even need to challenge their own beliefs and approaches towards how they portray girls' or boys' participation in sport and physical activity. However, the statistics suggest that this isn't being implemented on a big enough scale. So the same old men and women are biologically different notion is being recycled unchallenged, and when it is challenged, it is girls and women who are conforming to the default superior masculine sports. Male superiority strikes again. But we like to think that the sports media wouldn't allow things like this to happen because they're big corporations with a huge social responsibility. Do the sports media challenge the socially constructed biological and psychological differences between men and women? Do they Don't ask such silly questions. Sports media and sport rely on one another for income and success. So it is unsurprising that the sports media has just ended up regurgitating the ideas underpinning male superiority and domination in sport. Despite perceptions, the sports media are not a fountain of objectivity. Researchers have shown that the media plays a huge role in constructing images of men and women that imply natural differences between them. The writers, editors, presenters, and broadcasters all have their own biases and ideas informing what gets chosen as news and how the news is presented to you. For example, historically, coverage has portrayed men as physical and aggressive, focusing on their achievements, reinforcing that sport is their natural domain, whereas images of female athletes in the media were often described in terms of physical desirability to men, meaning being glamorized or sexualized, or were described in their domestic roles as wives and mothers, rather than the female athleticism on show, to reinforce sport was not natural to women. Obviously, such coverage now is rather outdated and would be quickly called out on social media, but that does not mean that essentialist ideas have gone. Now they just show up in more subtle ways. As we said, different branches are growing from the same gender essentialist tree and are taking new forms to survive. A 2021 paper found that while overtly sexualizing, patronizing, trivializing language had been on the decline, quote, most of the women's stories were presented by commentators with far less verbal pop and excitement than had typically characterised their men's sports stories. Routinely delivered in a dull monotone, women's sports stories, we observed, were usually presented as just boring. We labelled this frame gender-bland sexism. They also find that men's sport dominates coverage, which I'll dive into more in part 3. But again, this only confirms and legitimises essentialist logic. So, to sum up, the sports media took on the Victorian views of socially constructed biological differences between the sexes, then produced zero coverage of women's sport and reproduced stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, then said, well, our coverage proves that men and women are just biologically different, with men being naturally suited and better at sport. So it's only fair that we keep showing men's sport and show minimal women's sport. We are going round in circles again. And I can hear you asking, how are the media getting away with this? Hargreaves says, quote, popular versions of masculinity and femininity which suggest sexual difference are repeated and become commonplace, universalised, so that they feel natural and acceptable, whereas in reality they are preferred, constructed images. Then the supposedly impartial, objective media can turn around and say,
well, we just report what we see.
Did you see what I did there?
It's a scam.
But this ideology of male superiority couldn't be more obvious than in sport itself. Female bodybuilding is often presented as an example that conventional images of femininity are being challenged. Women can be physically strong and muscular, but bodybuilding has found a way to reinforce the gender division by telling women to wear bikinis, ribbons in the hair, makeup, nail varnish, and sometimes even breast silicone implants. In 2012, a new women's physique category was created, aimed at women who prefer to develop a less muscular, yet athletic and aesthetically pleasing physique, unlike former women's bodybuilders. The International Federation for Bodybuilding Assessment Criteria states, the judge has to compare muscle shape, density, and definition while still bearing in mind the competitor's overall balanced development and femininity. Hargreaves sums this up saying, quote, in the case of female bodybuilding, idealised femininity and sexuality are prior to and become more significant than muscularity and athleticism. This speaks to another enduring problem. Clothes. Women's sportswear has often been designed to maintain femininity and to remind us that female athletes are real women, so to not provide a direct challenge to male superiority in sport. I'm talking leotards in gymnastics, skirts in tennis and hockey, and dresses in netball, whereas men's sportswear is shorts, t-shirts, trousers and joggers. Female bodies then aren't the only thing being socially constructed. The clothes they wear are specifically curated to meet femininity standards. However, there is something underpinning all of this, giving ideals of femininity and masculinity extra influence. Heterosexual assumptions. When we talk about femininity and masculinity, these things are not isolated from each other, but exist in relation to each other. What is defined as masculine affects what is defined as feminine. Helen Lenski explains that in a context where being heterosexual is the norm, women's femininity is there to validate male identity and power. In other words, the whole point of being feminine is to meet the standards of what is attractive defined by heterosexual men. If heterosexuality wasn't the norm, then such standards wouldn't even exist. You wouldn't feel pressure to meet these ideals of what heterosexual men find attractive. As Lenski explains, quote, "Thus femininity is predicated on weakness, dependence, and individuality. Not simply an aesthetic, it is both a symbol and enactment of women's subordinate status. In sport, this explains why women face such pressures to present feminine appearances and behaviours while playing typically male-dominated sports. They still need to meet male-defined standards of attractiveness and demonstrate that they are straight. This is why women are still told to wear dresses in netball and ice skating, skirts in hockey and tennis, and leotards in gymnastics. It's why Ilona Maher, Serena Williams, and Simone Biles were ridiculed for being muscular. It's why female footballers and cricketers were once stigmatised for being too masculine, because of implications that they were pseudo-men, unfeminine, gay, masculine, butch, lesbians. It is why lesbian, bisexual, and queer women once felt the need to keep their sexuality a secret. It is why one of the greatest tennis players of all time, Billie Jean King, lost all of her commercial endorsements in the 1980s after she was outed in the media. King was asked to resign her presidency of the Women's Tennis Association because of her, quote, sexual perversion, and what was described as a lesbian witch hunt followed. It is why 40 years ago the most prominent women's sport organisations of the time went to great lengths to silence lesbians. And it plays a huge role in why 61% of teenage girls feel judged when doing sport, and 50% of teenage girls say they lack self-belief in sport. So, to quote Hargreaves again, sport constructs differences between different femininities and masculinities, as well as between males and females, meaning that there are hierarchies within ideals of femininity. The further you are from a young, white, straight, cis, non-disabled, middle-class woman, the more inferior your status is as a woman. Because older women, ethnic minority women, disabled women, working-class women, trans women, religious women often do not meet this Western definition of femininity and attractiveness. So this male superiority lives and breathes everywhere we go, and most particularly in sport. But this ideology isn't just about being able to say men are superior for the sake of it. These ideas and images were curated specifically to justify unequal power relations between men and women. So we've ended up in a situation where the majority of the power, influence, and wealth is in the hands of a group of men, meaning that this ideology has the power to influence our life circumstances hugely. It decides whether you'll ever have an interest in sport, what you're taught in PE, the coaches you have, the referees you have. It then decides whether you'll be able to play sport outside of school, how often you'll be able to play, what level you'll get to, how your teammates will treat you, the medical care you'll receive, what you wear, how the media will report about you in your personal life, or it decides how you'll be treated as a fan in a stadium, what matches you can watch live or on TV. It'll decide whether you get a job in sport, and if you do, it'll decide what you get paid and whether you'll ever get a promotion, or if you'll ever become CEO. This ideology decides whether you'll face violence and abuse on or off the sport field. It decides your safety. It decides your physical and mental well-being, and sometimes it will determine that for the rest of your life. It influences your every move no matter who you are. Race for women's sporting equality still has a long way left to run. More girls playing football is hard-won progress, but there is still a long way to go. Women's sport will keep growing as long as we keep winning. Women's sport at a tipping point, but still has a long way to go. Women's parity in sport has a long way to go, despite positive Paris signs. Apologies for the British bias here, but if you didn't quite get the message, women's sport has a, quote,
long way to go.
Quick disclaimer, this is in no way a criticism of the individual interviewees, writers and editors of these articles. Instead, I want to critique the wider collective notion that women's sport has a long way to go, something that I'm definitely guilty of saying. There are two main problems with this. Number one, the notion reallocates blame and responsibility to women and women's sports to make change, away from those hoarding power and influence. And number two, we actually have a really long way to go. Saying a long way to go simply does not cover it. Despite interventions like Title IX, the Equality Act in 2010 and the Lioness's Legacy package, governments in the UK and North America have somehow managed to give legitimacy to these ideologies. In 2010, the Equality Act was brought in to legally protect people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society, a perfect opportunity to challenge the idea that men are superior to women and should have power over them, right? However, unlike in most spheres of life where there is no legal justification to separate men and women, In sport, there is. Section 195 of this Act covers discrimination in sport. This section allows separate sporting competitions to continue to be organised for men and women, where physical strength, stamina, or physique are major factors in determining success or failure, and in which one sex is generally at a disadvantage in comparison with the other. Similarly, in USA, the 1972 Title IX of the Education Amendments intended to remove preferential treatment on the basis of sex in any education programme or activity receiving federal funds. But in the 1979 Title IX interpretations of the law, they decided to permit sex-segregated athletic programs with different athletic requirements, facilities, and funding schemes. In a 2021 paper, authors Hekstrom and Sethi write, "Rather than contest the preservation of football, liberal feminists cooperated with the state and sold the narrative that women are weaker and needed separate terrains of play and modified versions of men's games." The same can be said about the UK's Equality Act. Although both these governments are overwhelmingly in support of change in sport, their interventions only accept and give weight to the existing sport structures. And the legislation is rooted in gender essentialism. The law implicitly states that there are natural, biological, objective, physical differences between men and women, ignoring the careful and deliberate construction of such differences throughout history. As Hargreaves writes, government intervention does little to alter the structural and cultural patterns of discrimination that many people take for granted in their ordinary lives, and which have been the major causes of discrimination in sports in the first place. So let's give a big round of applause and 5 stars to our Western states for writing male superiority and domination into our laws. We couldn't have possibly done it without you. Woo! In the home, the domestic labour of women continues to service men's leisure and sport because of the enduring idea that women's proper place is in the home. It's often our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, our grandmothers, or female neighbours who provide unpaid domestic labour to our men and boys playing football, cricket, and rugby. These women have directly contributed to the careers of professional athletes and to sport as an institution. To quote Hargreaves, transport to practices and games, providing meals, catering for team visits, shopping for, laundering, mending and ironing team uniforms, waiting on the sidelines, attending to injured bodies. Yes, there are many women who are in paid work and they are married and have children, but this hasn't gotten rid of the idea that women's natural place is in the home. For men, leisure is seen as a right that they can easily pursue, with their abundance of disposable income, time and energy. For women, leisure is not perceived as a right, but often a rare pleasure to pursue once domestic chores are over. Schools are allowed to treat boys and girls in their PE programs as equal but different, meaning they are equal in value but have innate biological differences. So it would be acceptable to segregate girls and boys in PE, to not teach sports like football, cricket and rugby at all girls' schools, to not teach netball, hockey, rounders to all boys' schools, admit schools to teach girls netball and boys football, teach modified forms of competitive games such as tag rugby instead of rugby for girls, and softball cricket instead of hardball cricket for girls. And while dance is compulsory until Key Stage 3, it is acceptable at Key Stage 4 for dance to disappear for boys while staying with girls. It is unsurprising then that less than half of girls aged 5 to 11 take part in a team sport compared to 70% of boys. Yes, the guidance calls for staff to challenge the deep-rooted gender stereotypes, but as we've discussed, this definitely isn't happening on the necessary scale. It's also interesting how the harm of stereotypes is only presented for girls, ignoring how boys face immense pressure and harm to present masculinity. Equal opportunity programs always highlight that girls are the ones that are losing out and should be aiming to have the sports that boys have. They never acknowledge that boys maybe are deprived of the creative and artistic movements that come with dance. And then the guidance also puts the burden on teachers who are already overworked to educate themselves on very complicated stereotypes. The irony is that no point in these documents are the words femininity and masculinity or sexism or misogyny or equalising power relations between boys and girls mentioned. That's really going to help our teachers. So this whole equal opportunity approach means that we just end up doing sport under the same structures of male superiority and domination. Now to my favourite industry and the one that I work in, the sports media, also known as the mouthpiece for male superiority and domination. Research has found that there are, quote, persistent inequities in the quantity and quality of stories on men's and women's sports, which support the critique that, quote, mainstream sports media actively builds audiences for certain men's sports in ways that it does not do so for women's sports. So I can't help find it hilarious when people say,
Women's sport is being forced upon us. They're getting special treatment more than what they deserve.
In 2019, the coverage of women's sport on TV news and on ESPN Sports Centre was 5.1% and 5.7%. This means percentage coverage of women's sport hasn't changed since 1989 and 1993. Let that sink in. In the UK, figures are dismally low too. In 2023, 8% of TV coverage was for women's sport, down from 13% in 2022. So don't worry everyone, you have nothing to fear. You're all safe from women's sport. Oh, and guess what? There are a few women in the newsroom too. We can all relax. Most of our sports reports will be written by men. In written sports media, 90.1% of editors, 90.2% of assistant editors, 87.6% of columnists, 87.4% of reporters, and 80.8% of copy editors and designers are male. And even the people who run sport are more likely to be men. Internationally, women who hold prestigious positions are still a tiny minority. UK sport research found that across international federations and international sports organisations, women made up only 22% of members of boards or executive committees, 7% of presidents or chairs, and 21% of CEOs or Secretary Generals. To address this, it's been suggested that we should create boards for women's sports within sports organisations, and these are usually filled by women. Yay! Gender equality! However, this just constitutes further unnecessary division between men and women, reinforcing traditional assumptions about our differences that allow overall power to remain with men. This X post is a fantastic example of how people use the same arguments to justify men having power in coaching of men's and women's sports. It speaks to the two typical excuses for unequal representation in coaching. Men are seen as natural leaders and decision makers, while women are naturally expressive, cooperating, and caring. Or the men's game is harder, faster, more advanced because of the biological advantage. As women don't have that, they can't coach that. Both of these draw on the same rigid conceptions of masculinity and femininity, insisting on a constructed difference and separateness to stop female coaches having power in men's sport.
I've said this a million times over. You can find a female pilot, a female doctor, a female lawyer, a female banker. But you can't find a female coach working in the men's game, leading men. Just shows you how much work there is to be done.
This explains why there are many women coaches in elite sporting competitions like the Women's NBA, NWSL, the Women's Super League, but a tiny proportion in men's. It explains why there's never been a permanent female coach in the Premier League, or a head coach in the NBA or the NFL. The idea of power sharing between men and women in men's sport is so deeply disconcerting for some people still. Humanity will probably be wiped out by climate change by the time a woman becomes head coach of the England men's football, cricket or rugby team. And all of this said, I think most of us would agree, oh this is not good. Men having all the power is not good. You probably also agree that women should have equal access to any facilities, coaching or opportunities to compete. But when you bring up pay and sponsorship of female athletes, coaches or referees, suddenly male superiority and domination becomes okay again? Any conversations around pay disparity inevitably results in a media storm and social media descends into chaos. My new favourite example is when England footballer Lucy Bronze highlighted how female players couldn't retire on their salaries. The comments blew up saying, well, none of us can retire at age 35 and well, women's football doesn't generate anywhere near as much money as the men's. Even though, if you actually open the article and read it, yeah, I know you can do that. She's actually making a point about the wage disparity among female players. She actually has enough to retire. And most other players don't. That is the problem. She's not saying that all of them should be able to retire. The word men isn't even in the article, but we just can't resist bringing up the fact that men's sport brings in more money. This economic argument is always a convenient distraction from the fact that unequal pay and sponsorship is built on essentialist beliefs of natural differences between men and women. History shows that these beliefs put men and women's sport on entirely different trajectories. We saw that such beliefs were used to stop women from taking part in accessing resources, such as investment, facilities, coaching, equipment, marketing, advertising, sponsorships, and media coverage, all the while handing them to men's sport, allowing the men's game to rapidly advance while building an enormous audience and income. Then unequal pay and sponsorship was justified, and if anyone challenged it, the reply would just be either 1, men are naturally better at sport, so we'll pay them more, or 2, men generate more revenue and demand, so we're going to pay them more. Yes, we are going round in circles again. It is exhausting. We now have the most obscene levels of inequality. The highest salary in the Premier League is £20 million. The highest in the Women's Super League is around £200,000 to £400,000. The lowest Premier League salary is £3,462 a week, whereas the lowest WSL salary is $20,000 a year. Those in charge of sport have led us all to believe that it's just part of free market economics. You create more demand, you get paid more. It's also very much in the interest of the wealthy elite and the powerful bosses in charge of sport for us to defend this myth though. Channel the wealth and power into a few extremely wealthy clubs and away from every other club in the football pyramid? Yes, please. Imagine if wealth and power was redistributed away from the Premier League into the other leagues, the non-league and women's teams. Would you as a fan seriously lose out if your favourite player was paid £2 million instead of £20 million a year? Would the player even lose out? The only people who lose out are the people in power because they have to share. Of course though, power sharing is a naive fantasy, so things will just continue the way they are. We will continue fighting and distracting ourselves on social media about how much men and women should be paid, while the wealthy, powerful elite who set up such a system in the first place will simply lie back and laugh at us. And if you're thinking, I do agree that women's sport has been enormously constrained, but still we can't argue with economics. I mean, one day the women will catch up and will be paid equally. To that I'd say probably wind back 60 seconds on this video and then take a moment for some deep reflection. Then once you've done that, I'd say your suggestion is the equivalent of asking the guard dog of the evil villain to save you from the evil villain. You can't rely on audiences who have been raised on and fed a diet of male superiority and male domination to get rid of male superiority and male domination. In other words, this example is a completely impossible situation that could never happen under the current system. If every single sports fan in the entire world suddenly realised the ideology of male superiority pervading their lives and change their minds, then suddenly unequal power relations wouldn't be justifiable anymore. They wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have to wait for women to catch up because there would no longer be any unequal relations. As long as there are unequal power relations, there is also an ideology of male superiority at work. And as I've said before, the problem is not the women who need to catch up or the women who have a long way to go. It's the ideology of male superiority and domination that's to blame. The idea that women's sport will one day become the equivalent commercial success of men's sport is a myth. It's a story we continuously use to reassure ourselves that somehow justifies the current horribly unequal state of affairs for men and women. So, does women's sport have a long way to go? No, it is not women's sport that is the problem. And no, we don't have a long way to go. We have a really, really, really long way to go. But you would be mistaken if you think that getting rid of male superiority and domination solves all of our problems. This is only the beginning. This video is pretty limited because it doesn't speak for all women, just the experiences of Western white, middle class, heterosexual, cisgender, culturally Christian women. There are unequal power relations between men and women, but also between groups of women and groups of men, because of other layers of oppression like race and class and so on. And you'd also be mistaken in thinking that men are not losers under this current system of male superiority and domination. This has never been a women against men issue. Men may be guarantors of patriarchy, but they are also victims of it, as many academics have discussed. Quote, "Our power in society as men not only oppresses women, but also imprisons us in a deadening masculinity which cripples our relationships with each other, with women, with ourselves. In modern Western societies, men are victims in the sense that they are forced in a very brutal way to subjugate their sensitivities in favour of aggressive displays of masculinity. Yes, innate biological and psychological differences between men and women have been constructed to justify male superiority and domination, but this has always been to men's detriment too, particularly in combat sports like boxing, rugby and American football. Michael Messner calls this sport's biggest paradox. On one hand, top athletes are portrayed as the epitome of good physical conditioning and health, but most are likely to suffer from a very high incidence of permanent injuries, disabilities, alcoholism, drug abuse, obesity and heart problems. These sports teach men to view their own bodies as weapons, in the sense that they must do whatever is necessary to their bodies in order to beat an opponent. This means using violence against your own body, in the form of chronic injuries, permanent physical damage and mental health problems. And what stands out is that these athletes now stuck with permanent or long-term serious injuries from their sports careers would now do it all over again. Messner said that these athletes, quote, "wore these injuries with pride, like badges of masculine status, and were reluctant to acknowledge they gave up their healthy bodies for sporting success." Because if you, as an athlete, are asked to question your decision to sacrifice your health, you're also questioning the entire system that helped you find your career, community, relationships, a sense of belonging, and a sense of identity. To question the thing that has made your own very identity is obviously a very difficult thing to do. So athletes often rationalise it, claiming that it was just part of the game, and that the pain endured was important character development or helped them gain respect from other people. And violence against your own body isn't the only cost. The relationships that athletes develop with their own self and with others also suffers. The evidence shows that the sense of self you develop to be successful in violent sport often results in having a personality that devalues women and gay men and has problems in building and maintaining relationships. So combat and contact sport often burdens young boys and men with a violent, painful form of masculinity, which expects them to be aggressive, competitive, ignore their own pain, make horrible sacrifices and to fear anything feminine. But it's all okay because it's just part of the game. Men are then rewarded financially and socially for embodying this violent masculinity and for being alienated from their own bodies, and the media romanticizes this. We shouldn't assume that all men have equal power and privilege in sport either. There are great inequalities between different groups of men because of institutional racism, homophobia, classism, ableism. Black men, gay men, disabled men all face additional costs through punishment or being ostracised for not conforming to the standards of masculinity that sport expects. So it turns out that enforcing rigid heterosexual expectations of competitiveness, self-reliance, a willingness to sacrifice, obedience to authority, ignoring pain, and to fear anything feminine onto young boys and men is actually quite harmful. So what the heck do we do about this? As you can tell, I love talking about circles, so I'm going to take this back to the very beginning of our conversation, to our spectrum of popular beliefs about women's sport. There are the people who think that women shouldn't be playing sport and should be in the kitchen, the people who think women should play and progress but believe the standard is inferior so don't watch it, and the people who love women's sport, see equal entertainment value and skill, but believe in different categories for men and women. All three views are recycled versions of gender essentialist thought, the foundation of the ideology of male superiority in sport. It's about recognising that the same forces that constrain sports women and men over the past 2 centuries have never gone away. These patriarchal forces are simply repackaging themselves in more subtle and palatable ways than ever before, and they often come under a guise of protecting women. But the reality is, sport promotes the idea that men are superior to women through ideas about differences between men and women. And this is legitimising men having power over women, and we mustn't fall for it any longer. And please don't think all is lost. There are ways to do sport differently for everyone's benefit. Those in power just don't want you to know about it. Hargreaves presents Paul Willis's radical alternative. Sport could be presented as a form of activity which emphasises human similarity and not dissimilarity. A form of activity which isn't competitive and measured, a form of activity which expresses values which are indeed unmeasurable, a form of activity which is concerned with individual well-being and satisfaction rather than with comparison. In such a view of sport, differences between the sexes would be unimportant, unnoticed. I desperately need to draw this video to an end, but I can just hear people going,
Well, actually, men are biologically superior to women.
congratulations on getting this far in the video and missing the point spectacularly. I am not saying that men and women are no different to each other on sporting performance. On average, men are taller, stronger, heavier, have more muscle mass, greater lung capacity and larger hearts. This means generally men are stronger, speedier and more powerful than sportswomen. But what I am saying is that this perspective, quote, never asks us to question why sporting practices in our culture are defined in ways that allow men to display their physical strength, speed and power, nor does it question why the performance gap in sport is given so much attention and how this is used to bolster images of male power and dominance as natural and immutable. In other words, ask yourself, why has sport made us so obsessed with the biological gap between the sexes? Why does sport conveniently ignore all the cultural, economic, ideological and psychological forces that have played a role in constructing such a gap? Why are we still relying on the men are biologically different to women argument when history shows that it's only ever constrained progress? Whose interest does the men and women are biologically different argument actually protect? And whose interest does it serve to have sport divided by gender? I'm going to shut up now. I want to say a huge thank you for watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this discussion, so please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe and use the comment section below. Any topics or talking points you want me to cover in future videos, please feel free to comment those below too. Speak to you in the next video.